Hello, and welcome back to The Sleeping Shogun. Tonight, we are traveling far out to the edge of the old world, to the closing decades of the 13th century, and to a stretch of cold, gray water that lies between the shoulder of the Asian mainland and the western shore of Japan. Picture that sea at night, the slow swells, the smell of salt and wet pine, a single lantern swinging on the deck of a wooden boat. The islands out here are small, and the wind never entirely stops, and for most of their long, quiet history, almost nothing of any importance ever happened to them at all. Almost everyone has heard, in some worn and half-remembered way, of the divine wind, the kamikaze, a word formed from kami, meaning divine or spirit, and kaze, meaning wind. It is the great storm that is said to have saved Japan from the largest empire the world had ever seen. It is one of those stories that has been told so often and carried so far that it has gone smooth at the edges, like a pebble turned over and over in a river. But the storm comes at the very end of this tale. Tonight we are beginning long before it, in a far quieter place, on an evening when no one living on these islands had any particular reason to be afraid. Before we set out, if you find these nights restful, you might leave a like and subscribe, so the next story can find its way to you on some other sleepless evening. And if you would, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are and what hour it is where you are lying. There is an odd and gentle comfort in knowing how many of us are awake at the same moment in our separate darknesses, listening to the same slow voice. Now, settle in, adjust your pillow, let your hands grow heavy, and let your shoulders ease down, away from your ears. You do not need to hold on to every name or every date. Let them drift past you like the sound of that far-off sea. I will keep talking, and the night will take care of the rest. So, let the dark settle around you, and let us begin. An empire that reached the sea. To understand these small islands, you first have to understand the shadow that was about to fall across them. In the middle of that century, a single family from the cold grasslands of the north had assembled the largest land empire there has ever been, before or since. It had begun 2 generations earlier under a warlord the world would come to call Genghis Khan, and by the time his grandson Kublai sat at the head of it, the empire is thought to have covered something close to 1/5 of all the dry land on Earth, and to have held under its hand perhaps 1/4 of every living person. Though figures from that age are estimates piled on estimates, and the truth is simply that it was larger than anything people had a way of measuring. Kublai had made himself master of China and had given his dynasty a Chinese name, the Yuan, the way a conqueror will sometimes put on the clothes of the country he has just taken. From the new capital he was building in the north, his attention drifted, almost as an afterthought, out toward the islands lying off the eastern coast. To a man who governed 1/4 of the people on Earth, Japan must have looked like a small and untidy, loose thread, the sort of thing a tidy ruler pulls without quite thinking about it. So he sent letters. They were carried east through the kingdom of Goryeo in Korea, which had already learned what it cost to refuse him, and they were addressed, grandly, to the ruler of Japan. The wording was courteous. It was courteous in the particular way that very powerful people are courteous when they are entirely certain they are going to get what they want. Full of warm phrases about friendship and the avoidance of arms, which is the language that usually means the opposite of what it says. The letters reached the imperial court in the capital and the warrior government down in Kamakura that truly ran the country. The court, by some accounts, drafted a careful and conciliatory reply, weighing every word. The men in Kamakura decided that the better answer was no answer at all. There is an old and recurring temptation to deal with a difficult letter by simply not replying to it, a strategy that does buy a little quiet, though seldom as much of it as one hopes. The man who held the real power in Kamakura was the regent, the shiken, Hojo Tokimune, who at this point was not yet 20 years old. Why exactly he chose silence and then chose to keep choosing it as the letters kept coming is something the records do not fully explain, and historians have argued about it for a very long time. Youth, perhaps, pride, a genuine reading of the danger. Whatever moved him, silence hardened into refusal, and refusal hardened into the policy of a nation. And so the first place the empire's hand would come down was the threshold. The islands of Tsushima and Iki, set out in the strait like two stepping stones between the continent and the mainland of Japan. Tsushima lies so far out toward Asia that, on a clear day, from its high ground, you can make out the mountains of the Korean peninsula across the water. For centuries, it had lived as a place of crossing and quiet trade, an island accustomed to strangers, where foreign ships were a part of ordinary life rather than a cause for alarm. It was here, in the spring of 1269, that the empire first touched Japan with its own hands. A ship arrived carrying envoys of the Khan, and when the islanders would not let them pass on toward the capital, there was friction, the kind of small, sharp confrontation that flares up at a border and then is over. And in the middle of it, the envoys seized two of the local men. They were, by most accounts, ordinary islanders, remembered now only by the names Tojiro and Yajiro, and they were taken aboard and carried back across the sea, all the way to Dahdu, the vast new capital rising in the north on the ground where Beijing stands today. There, it is said, the two men were walked through the streets of that enormous city and shown its walls and its markets and its endless crowds, and, though here the story grows uncertain, brought before the Khan himself. The purpose was not cruelty. The purpose was for them to see the sheer size of the thing, to feel it in their own bodies, so that when they were sent home again, they would carry the knowledge back with them like a fever. And so two unremarkable men from the smallest, furthest edge of Japan came home with a story that almost no one could quite bring themselves to believe. The largest events in history rarely arrive looking large. They tend to come first as an improbable tale told by someone who has been somewhere far away, a thing too strange to be credited and too oddly specific to be wholly dismissed. For now, the strait went quiet again. The lanterns of Tsushima burned the way they always had, and the fishermen went out the way they always had, and the wind kept up its endless work against the pines. The first island. For centuries, the people of Tsushima lived by a rhythm that was dictated entirely by the water around them. It is a rugged place of steep, forested hills that drop straight into the sea, leaving very little flat land for the growing of rice. Because of this, the islanders looked outward. They became people of the sea, fishermen who knew the shifts of the local currents, and traders who moved quietly between the ports of Kyushu and the southern coast of the Korean peninsula. To live on an island like Tsushima was to understand that the sea was not a wall, but a highway, a place where strangers arrived with some regularity, bringing with them trade goods, foreign coins, and news from places most ordinary people would never see. It was a life accustomed to the gray horizons of the strait and to the small, predictable frictions of a borderland. But it was not a life prepared for the sheer weight of what was gathering on the opposite shore. In the autumn of 1274, the long silence that had followed the return of the two abducted islanders, Tojiro and Yajiro, came to an end. On the 5th day of the 10th month, a time when the autumn air begins to turn sharp and the northern winds carry the first real hint of the coming winter, a vast forest of masts appeared on the horizon. It was an armada of 900 ships, carrying a force of some 25,000 men, moving with a heavy, collective purpose toward the western coast of the island. They made for Tsusura, a small bay where the hills parted just enough to allow a river to meet the sea, creating a rare stretch of sandy beach. The news traveled across the island's narrow trails to the provincial capital, where the defense of Tsushima rested on the shoulders of the governor's representative, a veteran warrior named So Sukakuni. He was 68 years old, an advanced age for a samurai in an era when violence and disease tended to make life short, and an age when most men of his station had already shaved their heads, taken Buddhist vows, and left the business of war to their sons. But Sukakuni did not have the luxury of retirement. He gathered what men he could, mounted his horse, and rode through the night toward the sound of the sea. For generations, early accounts often framed the first encounter as a near overwhelming shock to the defenders, a narrative of complete helplessness that has often been repeated in local histories and popular retellings. But the truth of medieval warfare is rarely so neat, and modern historians looking closely at the way samurai households were structured suggest a slightly different picture. While old chronicles emphasize that Sukakuni arrived on the beach with a force of only 80 horsemen, each of those mounted warriors of status would have been accompanied by his personal attendants, his foot soldiers, and perhaps local hunters and fishermen who had picked up bows to defend their homes. The actual force on the sand that morning was likely closer to 200 or 300 men, still an impossibly small number against an armada, but a reality made of flesh, bone, and stubborn resistance rather than mere helplessness. When the sun rose over Tsusura, Sukakuni attempted the traditional protocol of foreign diplomacy. He sent translators to the water's edge to ask the intent of the fleet, though the answer was already being delivered in the form of thousands of soldiers wading through the surf. The warfare that followed was a collision of two entirely different worlds. The samurai were accustomed to individual combat, a ritualized exchange where a warrior rode forward, proclaimed his lineage and his past exploits, and sought out an enemy of equal rank for a duel with bows or swords. The force landing on the beach, however, moved as a single, disciplined machine. They fought to the sound of drums and gongs, staying behind dense walls of shields, and they deployed weapons that the defenders had never seen. Short, powerful composite bows that shot arrows that period accounts describe as poisoned, and iron casings filled with gunpowder that exploded with a sound like thunder, throwing horses into panic. The defense of Tsusura was brief, and it was absolute. By the time the afternoon sun began to dip behind the hills, So Sukakuni and every man who had stood with him on the beach were dead. The fighting had been merciless, and when the islanders returned after the tide of war had moved on, they gathered their dead and laid them to rest in separate mounds. To this day, if you walk through the quiet lanes of the Sasu area, you will find small, moss-covered mounds hidden among the trees. The Kubizuka, or the mound of the heads, and the Dozuka, the mound of the torsos. They are small, unremarkable piles of stones and earth, identical to the hills around them, holding the memory of a single morning when the world changed. Later local traditions suggest that some 80 years after that morning, when the immediate terror had faded into local memory, a small wooden structure was established near the sand where the old man had died. It was called Komodahama Shrine. To this day, the people of the island still gather at the shrine each autumn for a memorial festival, quieting the spirits of those who fell on the sand. A small community keeping its own losses closer than the grand narratives of the nation. The destruction of the island's defense was followed by a winter of great hardship, but the history of these places does not stop at the edge of a grave. No record remains to mark the exact day when the first salt pan was lit along the shore to begin the long work of recovery. Instead, history left behind a dry, administrative document from the year 1319, in which the lords who governed the island from across the water issued orders to collect taxes from the new salt pans of Tsushima. It was an entirely bureaucratic gesture, devoid of sentiment, and yet it remains a profound proof of survival. For a government seldom takes the trouble to tax an enterprise unless its people have managed to make it work. It would take nearly 2 centuries more until the year 1506 for the specific name Komota no Kama, the kilns of Komota, to finally appear in written registers. The village had effectively written its name back into the records through the steady, gray smoke of burning wood. In the modern world, the memory of that morning on the beach has traveled far beyond the shores of Tsushima, carried to the corners of the earth by digital landscapes and international stories like Ghost of Tsushima. Travelers now come from thousands of miles away to stand on the sand at Tsusura, looking out at the same cold water that the old governor watched on his last night. They find an island that is remarkably quiet, where the trees have grown over the old battlefields, and the wind sounds exactly as it did before the first ship appeared. On a still evening, the smoke from the local houses rises straight into the autumn air, disappearing against the gray hills, while the small lanterns of the fishing boats begin to flicker out on the water, one by one. The word for cruelty. If you sail southeast from the high cliffs of Tsushima, following the path of the cold northern currents for some 40 miles, you will come to a very different kind of land. The island of Iki does not hide behind steep, forested mountains. It is a place of low, rolling hills, wide plains, and quiet bays, where the water moves softly against flat beaches. For centuries, it was a landscape dedicated to the slow, domestic rhythms of farming and coastal fishing. It was a place where people grew barley, raised cattle, and gathered sea urchins from the shallow reefs. A small, self-contained world that had known only one major foreign intervention in its long history. A brief and half-remembered raid by northern pirates some 250 years before. To the families who lived along its quiet paths in the middle of the 13th century, the outside world was something that arrived in small quantities, carried by passing merchant vessels or the changing of the seasons. It was a landscape that measured time by the planting of crops and the gathering of wood, completely unaware that it lay directly in the path of a gathering storm. On the 14th day of the 10th month of 1274, only 9 days after the smoke had cleared from the beaches of Tsushima, the same forest of masts appeared off the northern shore of Iki. The defense of this second stepping stone fell to the island's military governor, a warrior named Taira no Kagetaka. He was a man who understood the limitations of his position. Unlike the open beaches of Sasura, Kagetaka chose to make his stand behind the wooden palisades of Hizume Castle, a modest fortification that sat upon a low hill, looking out over the surrounding fields. He gathered a force that old accounts estimate at roughly 100 horsemen, a small assembly of local landholders and their immediate kin, standing on the ramparts as the sky turned the color of iron. The siege that followed was short, and the outcome was never in doubt. The wooden walls of the small castle offered little protection against the disciplined formations and the exploding iron casings of the invaders. Recognizing that the defense was failing, Kagetaka made a final, desperate decision to send word to the mainland of Kyushu, hoping that someone might carry the news of the island's fate to the great military center at Dazaifu. He entrusted this task to a trusted retainer named Sozaburo, and alongside him, according to local traditions, went Kagetaka's own daughter, a young woman remembered now only by the title of Hime Gozen. The island still tells of their escape through the shifting shadows of the pine forests, a desperate ride toward the southern coast to find a boat before the harbor was completely closed. The transmission of history often relies on these small, fragmented tales of flight. Sozaburo managed to slip past the ships in the strait, carrying the warning to the mainland, but the daughter of the governor did not survive the journey across the fields. Local tradition tells that she was struck by a poisoned arrow on the road, and, unable to go further and unwilling to be seen in her final moments, she took her own life in the fields she had known since childhood. Today, a small stone marker known as the Hime Gozen Zuka sits quietly in the grass south of Shinjo Shrine, a small, mossy mound that serves as the only remaining punctuation mark at the end of her story. Back at Hizume Castle, the palisades were breached, and Taira no Kagetaka, following the severe code of his class, ended his own life alongside his family as the buildings burned around them. When a great force moves through a small place, the grand strategies of rulers dissolve into the private, desperate choices of ordinary people. With the castle gone, the farmers and fishermen of Iki fled into the interior, seeking refuge in the natural volcanic caves and dark crevices of basalt that riddle the island's landscape. One such place, known now as the hiding hole of Jitokwan, remains embedded in the local earth, a dark, damp cleft in the ground where families huddled in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar language of soldiers passing on the trails above. Those who did not find shelter were caught in the shifting tides of the occupation, and when the ships finally departed, the survivors gathered the remains of their neighbors and buried them in collective mounds. These sites, known simply as the Seninzuka, or the Mounds of 1,000 Souls, still sit in various corners of the island. Small green swells in the earth that look like nothing more than natural hills until one stops to read the old characters carved into the stone markers nearby. The memory of that autumn did not vanish when the army left. Instead, it settled into the language and the domestic life of the island, transforming a historical trauma into the quiet rituals of childhood. For centuries, mothers on Iki would quiet their restless children on stormy nights by whispering that the mukuri and the kokuri, old corruptions of the words for the Mongols and the Koreans, would come to take them away if they did not sleep. To reinforce this warning, local craftsmen began to fashion small, wooden toys known as mukuri kokuri dolls. They were simple, rustic things, carved with basic features that represent the foreign warriors of the old tales, designed not to terrify, but to bring a sense of domestic order to the household. A similar transformation occurred within the Japanese language itself. There is a persistent local tradition suggesting that the common Japanese word mugoi, which denotes an act of extreme cruelty or heartbreaking distress, found its modern shape during these weeks, derived from the whispered terror of the mukuri. While modern linguists tend to treat this as a piece of folk etymology, a creative story invented after the fact to explain a word that already existed, the survival of the legend speaks to something real. It demonstrates how deeply the events of that October were absorbed into the collective consciousness, until people could no longer imagine a concept of cruelty that did not carry the shadow of the northern ships. But an island cannot live forever in the shadow of an old war. Eventually, the smoke from the burning palisades cleared, and the regular business of survival returned to the valleys of Iki. The fields were planted with barley once more. The cattle returned to the low hills, and the boats went back out over the shallow reefs. The same slow, domestic rhythms the island had always known resumed almost in defiance of what had interrupted them. By the time the next generation grew old, the memory of the invasion had become something fixed, ancient, and still. On a modern autumn evening, the plains of Iki look remarkably peaceful. The old toy itself has all but vanished. The craftsmen who carved them are gone, but the figure survives in another form. At a small shrine on the island, a shrine dedicated to the god of the moon known as Tsukiyomi Shrine. Simple wooden charms in the shape of the mukuri kokuri are still offered today, hung at doorways and household altars to keep misfortune away. Near the old paths, the lanterns begin to flicker on as the night settles over the green mounds of the Seninzuka. The fields are quiet. The small wooden charms swing softly in the evening breeze, and the island rests under the long, steady breath of the sea. The shore that did not break. To move from the smaller, lonely islands of the strait to the great crescent bay of Hakata is to enter the true gateway of Western Japan. In the late autumn of 1274, this long stretch of sandy, pine-rimmed shore was not a place of remote wilderness, but a bustling cultural threshold, heavily populated and closely watched by the warrior families of Kyushu. For generations, the men who held land along these waters had lived with their eyes turned toward the sea, managing the small legal arrivals of merchants and monks, while maintaining a fierce domestic readiness for war. They were a distinct class of warriors, shaped by old internal rivalries and the harsh memory of the Genpei Wars. Men who measured their worth not by service to a distant state, but by the physical boundaries of their fields and the personal recognition of their lords. When the northern fleet finally rounded the headlands and cast their anchors in the shallow waters of the bay on the 20th day of the 10th month, they did not find an empty shore or a helpless peasantry. They found a coast that had drawn a deep, quiet breath, waiting for the first touch of the tide. The defense of this vital mainland shore fell to the Grand Commander of the Western forces, a seasoned and meticulous warrior named Shoni Kagasuke. He was a commander who understood the severe geometry of the terrain, and as the enemy began their coordinated landings, carrying their heavy shields and iron explosives through the surf, Kagasuke chose a policy of deliberate patience. He established his main headquarters at Iki no Hama, keeping his forces consolidated on the flat ground, where they could maintain their lines and observe the movements of the invading army. From this position, he watched as the northern forces advanced inland, securing the high ground of Akasaka, a strategic ridge that commanded the surrounding landscape. Kagasuke's intent was clear and defensive: to wait for the enemy to descend from the heights, to exhaust themselves against a steady line, and to force them into a terrain where the local horsemen held the advantage. It was a calculated, orderly strategy that looked perfectly reasonable on a commander's map, and yet it entirely failed to account for the stubborn, uncontrollable reality of the men who actually fought under his banner. For the medieval samurai, war was not a matter of state discipline or the silent movement of anonymous ranks. It was a deeply personal, competitive enterprise where a man's family fortune rested entirely on his ability to perform a single, undeniable act of bravery before witnesses. To wait quietly in a defensive line at the commander's tent was to risk being forgotten when the rewards were distributed after the victory. This desperate hunger for recognition was personified that morning by the head of a proud warrior house from Higo province, a man named Kikuchi Takefusa. Whatever his rank, the logic that moved him was the same logic that moved every man on that shore: honor witnessed or nothing. As he looked up at the pine forests of Akasaka, where the enemy had established their positions, Takefusa decided that his own honor could not wait for a general's signal. Without orders, and with a following of roughly 100 horsemen, Takefusa turned his back on the main defensive line at the shore and charged directly up the slope into the heart of the enemy lines. There was a strange arithmetic in the wars of this age. The intense desire for personal glory, which so often broke the discipline of an army, was precisely the quality that made that army so dangerous to an invader. Individual ambition overrode the careful plans of commanders, and yet the sheer individual ferocity of the charge caught the foreign formations completely unprepared. In the narrow spaces among the pines, where the heavy collective shields and long spears of the invaders were difficult to maneuver, the loose, fluid group of Japanese horsemen moved with a devastating, singular purpose, cutting through the positions and forcing the advanced units of the enemy into a chaotic retreat toward the high ground of Sohara. In the strange economy of medieval warfare, that chaos often functioned with a brutal, unexpected efficiency. As the afternoon light faded over the bay, the defenders experienced the strange power of the tetsuhou, those heavy iron casings packed with black powder that flew through the air with a blinding flash, a weapon that shattered the air with the sound of thunder and caused horses to bolt in terror. Through the heavy fighting, the defending forces took casualties and eventually withdrew to internal defensive positions inland to consolidate their strength, leaving the invaders in possession of nothing but the bare sand of the beach. Having failed to break through to the interior, the northern forces did not risk spending the night in the captured mansions of the local lords. Instead, they returned to their own ships before darkness fully fell, looking back at a dark coastline, a land that seemed to hold an inexhaustible supply of angry horsemen. The retreat of the northern fleet that night has long been surrounded by the grand language of miracles, and yet contemporary records suggest a far more administrative and deliberate reality. Recent historical consensus indicates that the withdrawal was not caused by a sudden supernatural wind that destroyed a fleet at anchor, but was a calculated decision made by the foreign commanders who realized that their initial invasion had stalled against a stubborn, intractable defense. They chose to board their ships and pull away from the dangerous shore before they were trapped by the morning tide. The true catastrophe did not occur within the sheltered waters of the bay, but out in the open strait during the journey home, when the fleet encountered a severe early winter storm, a deep, freezing, low-pressure system common to these waters. The official records of Goryeo, known as the Goryeosa, preserve the cold final ledger of that crossing, noting simply that some 13,500 men never returned to their homes. It is a quiet, specific number that carries the weight of a long winter night, transforming a story of sudden divine intervention into a vast, silent loss scattered across the gray water. Today, if you visit the modern city that has grown over the old shores of Hakata, you will find that the names of those ancient battlefields have settled quietly into the ordinary geography of everyday life. People now catch trains and buy groceries at places called Akasaka and Sahara, completely unconcerned with the desperate charges that once broke through the pines. On an autumn evening, the modern lights of the city begin to reflect across the dark, calm water of the bay, while out in the strait, the deep channels go entirely dark. The shores are still. The ancient ridges are covered by the soft shadow of the night, and the slow, rhythmic murmur of the small waves continues its endless work against the sand. The stones along the shore. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the departure of a great army, a quiet that is filled not with peace, but with the sudden, heavy awareness of what must be done before they return. In the spring of 1275, as the coastal villages of Kyushu began the long work of clearing the debris from the winter storms, the warrior government down in Kamakura was already measuring the horizon. They understood, with the practical clarity of men who lived by the sword, that the empire across the water had not been defeated. It had simply been paused. The response from the continent arrived in the 4th month of that year, carried by 5 envoys led by a diplomat named Du Shijong. They came with the same grand letters, demanding that the rulers of Japan travel to the northern capital to bow before the Khan, carrying with them the implicit promise of total destruction if they refused. The letters were carried along the eastern highways to Kamakura, where the young regent, Hojo Tokimune, chose a response that was both absolute and irreversible. He did not draft a cautious reply, nor did he return to the policy of silence that had defined his earlier years. Instead, he ordered the 5 envoys to be taken to the execution grounds at Tatsunokuchi, a lonely stretch of sand near the coast, where the state rid itself of its most dangerous elements. There, on an autumn morning in 1275, the diplomats were executed. Their lives ended in the gray light within sight of the sea they had just crossed. To kill an official emissary in the medieval world was to tear up the map of diplomacy entirely, a gesture that signaled to every warrior in the land that the bridges behind them had been burned, and that the only remaining language between the two nations was the language of the shield and the wall. The physical manifestation of that refusal began in the early months of 1276, when Kamakura issued orders to construct a barrier along the entire crescent of Hakata Bay. It was a massive defensive undertaking, known to history as the Genko Borui, or the Mongol Defense Wall, and yet the method of its creation was deeply fragmented and domestic. Rather than employing a vast, anonymous labor force, the government divided the 20 kilometers of coastline into tiny, specific sections, assigning each parcel to a different warrior family of Kyushu based strictly on the size of their landholdings. Only those coastal provinces designated for immediate frontline guard duty were exempt from this specific labor tax. For the rest, the construction was a matter of intense family obligation. Lords from distant valleys arrived with their private retainers, their cousins, and their laborers, each group responsible for building a specific few meters of stone. Because of this competitive, decentralized structure, the main sections of the wall rose with astonishing speed, appearing along the sand in a little over 6 months. The structure they built was not a grand monument of uniform engineering, but a long, irregular line that reflected the varied fortunes and skills of the men who piled the stone. To walk the line was to see the map of Kyushu itself, written in stone. The men of Osumi and Hyuga, assigned the stretch at Imazu, faced their wall with stone on both sides and filled it solid. The men of Higo, a few miles down the coast, built theirs with stone on the seaward face alone. Each province left its own signature in the way it stacked its fear. It was a wall built by 1,000 separate hands, each block carried through the surf and placed with the knowledge that the makers themselves would be the ones standing behind it when the sails reappeared. The true weight of the wall, however, lay not in the speed of its construction, but in the long, exhausting decades that followed its completion. History often treats defensive barriers as simple backdrops to a single morning of battle, completely ignoring the slow, domestic erosion of keeping them standing. After the primary structure was finished in 1276, and even long after the second great invasion had come and gone, the obligation to guard and maintain the stone line remained fixed upon the warrior houses of the West. For more than half a century, stretching across generations until the Kamakura government itself collapsed in the 14th century, samurai families were required to leave their homes for months at a time to perform banyaku, the endless routine of coastal guard duty. There was a heavy administrative routine to this vigil. A warrior would spend his days patrolling the stone ramparts, clearing the sand that the winter gales piled against the base, and repairing the sections where the high tides had loosened the stones. It was an existence defined by salt air, wet firewood, and the constant, monotonous rhythm of watching a horizon where nothing ever happened. Young men grew old on those rocks, learning the shifts of the Hakata winds, while their fields back home were managed by wives and aged uncles. The wall became a permanent, draining presence in the life of the province, an endless lease that had to be renewed with daily labor and private funds. It was a structure born of a sudden crisis, maintained through 50 years of quiet, cold nights. In the modern landscape of Fukuoka, much of the stone barrier has undergone a long, quiet burial, sleeping unseen beneath the modern city as the sand blown from the beaches gradually covered the old alignments. Today, however, you will find these ancient stones in unexpected places. On the campus of Seinan Gakuen University, a section of the wall sleeps in a quiet courtyard, discovered in 1999, when the university began digging the foundations for a new building and found the 13th century waiting underneath. It now stands restored among the lecture halls, where students pass it every day on their way to class. They are low, mossy barriers, completely integrated into the daily walks of commuters who pass them without a glance. A half-century of warrior sweat and cold vigils transformed into a pleasant, shaded boundary at the edge of a modern lawn. On a still evening, the preserved sections of the wall grow cold beneath the shadow of the pines. The city noises fade into the background, leaving only the low, rhythmic wash of the bay against the distant concrete dikes. The stones, carried down from the hills 700 years ago by men who were terrified of what lay beyond the water, remain fixed in their old alignments, their dark faces holding the dampness of the night air. The modern streets grow quiet. The office lights click off one by one, and the old wall rests in the dark, still guarding a shore that has long forgotten the shape of the foreign ships. And then they came again. For 5 years, the stone line along the crescent of Hakata Bay remained empty, a silent gray barrier left to face nothing but the tide and the winter sand. To the samurai who spent their long nights on Banyaku guard duty, watching a horizon that refused to change, the great invasion of 1274 must have begun to feel like an ancient story. A sharp, brief winter storm that had broken over the shore and then vanished back into the dark. Yet across the water, the machinery of the empire had not ceased its slow collective labor. Kublai Khan had spent those 7 intervening years absorbing the vast, wealthy territories of the southern Song dynasty, turning the immense timber forests and sophisticated shipyards of southern China toward a single, unrelenting purpose. In the 5th month of 1281, the Eastern Fleet launched the first wave of the new assault, striking the threshold islands of Tsushima and Iki once more, before pressing onward to the mainland. When the full combined sails reappeared off the coast of Kyushu in the summer, the scale of what arrived surpassed anything the islands had ever witnessed. Old registers state that the invasion was carried by 2 separate fleets totaling over 4,000 vessels and carrying some 140,000 men, a maritime forest so dense that period chroniclers described the water itself as being completely hidden beneath a canopy of wood and rope. The grand strategy of the Armada relied on securing a stable foothold on the mainland, and as the eastern ships advanced into the bay on the 6th day of the 6th month, their initial movements focused on the narrow, sandy spit of Shikanoshima. This island, connected to the mainland by a low land bridge that disappeared with the high tide, became the immediate theater for a desperate, fluid conflict. The defenders, understanding that to lose the island was to allow the enemy a staging ground behind their defenses, launched a series of small, relentless counterattacks. Warriors from Kyushu utilized their small, highly maneuverable coastal fishing boats, rowing out into the deep channels under the cover of the morning mist to board the massive foreign transports. It was a chaotic style of engagement fought in the narrow spaces between decks, where the heavy armor of the samurai countered the short spears of the continental ranks, turning the shallow waters around the spit into a crowded graveyard of broken oars and drifting banners. Despite the ferocity of the fighting on Shikanoshima, the true strategic crisis of the summer was decided along the miles of the mainland shore, where the invading forces encountered the long, irregular line of stone that had been raised 5 years before. The Genko Barui performed its domestic function with a heavy, stubborn efficiency. As the massive troop transports attempted to ground themselves in the surf, the soldiers looked up to find a continuous 2-meter wall of dark stones and packed earth, lined with thousands of silent horsemen whose bows were already drawn. The collective tactics that had functioned so effectively on the open sand of Sasura were useless here. There was no space to deploy dense shield walls, no flat ground to form the rhythmic ranks that moved to the sound of gongs, and no easy path to bring the exploding Tetsuhao casings to bear on the interior. Every attempt to force a crossing was met by a steady rain of arrows from an enemy that refused to come out into the open to duel. This structural frustration transformed what should have been a swift, decisive invasion into a long, suffocating maritime siege. Frustrated by the stone wall at Hakata, the Eastern Fleet withdrew from the bay, moving backward toward the island of Iki to wait for the arrival of the massive Southern Fleet coming from China. By the late weeks of the 7th month, the two immense armadas finally consolidated their strength near the island of Hirado, before moving together toward a new strategic staging area down in Imari Bay, anchoring in the sheltered waters around the island of Takashima to prepare for a massive coordinated assault on the mainland shore. There was a strange, exhausted rhythm to those summer weeks, a vast collective waiting in which both armies seemed suspended between the earth and the sky. Even as they rested at anchor, the defenders refused to grant them peace. On the 27th and 28th days of the month, Japanese warriors launched daring night raids in small boats, setting fire to transports and keeping the foreign crews in a state of constant, exhausting vigilance beneath the burning sun. The resolution of this long summer stalemate arrived through the shifting of the deep thermal currents that govern these western seas during the transition of the seasons. On the final night of the 7th month, extending into the first day of the intercalary 7th month, as the heavy air grew perfectly still and the sky turned a deep, bruised copper, the wind began to shift with a sudden, erratic violence. It was the arrival of a massive late summer typhoon, a regular atmospheric convergence that moves up from the southern tropics with a force that defies the structures of men. As the gale accelerated through the dark, turning the waters around Takashima into a churning cauldron of black foam, the floating wooden city of the empire, lashed together with heavy iron chains and great timber booms, began to destroy itself. The heavy structures became instruments of ruin, pulling vessels into violent collisions that shattered hulls, snapped masts, and dropped thousands of armored men into the dark, churning surf. On the island of Shikanoshima, where the fighting once raged across the narrow spit, there stands a quiet stone monument, the Mokozuka, or the Mongol Mound. It was raised not by the victors of that era, but by Japanese hands centuries later, in 1927, to console the spirits of the invading soldiers who never returned home. It is a strange and gentle thing to build, a memorial for the men who came to conquer you. Among the older fishermen of these waters, it is said that some words were long avoided out on the open sea, and the name of the old enemy was one of them. The sea, it seems, was given the silence, and the land was given the stone. Today, miles away in the quiet waters of Imari Bay around Takashima, the sea has long returned to its old uniformity, leaving no surface sign of the thousands of hulls that sank beneath the waves during that terrifying night. On a modern summer evening, the waters of the bay are perfectly still, reflecting the distant yellow lights of the docks, while the pine trees along the old shore stand motionless in the dark, watching a calm gray expanse that holds its secrets deep within the earth. The Spared. When the great storm of 1281 finally rolled back into the northern horizon, leaving the gray waters of Imari Bay empty of its 4,000 ships, the immediate business of war dissolved into a vast, silent landscape of wreckage and survival. For miles along the shores of Takashima, where the desperate foreign fleet had spent its final nights at anchor, the tide began to wash up the physical remnants of the ruined armada. Broken timber beams, tangled hemp ropes, and thousands of foreign soldiers who had managed to cling to pieces of shattered hulls during the terrifying night. These men, estimated by contemporary chroniclers to number in the tens of thousands, were no longer a disciplined imperial machine moving to the rhythm of gongs. They were exhausted, soaked, and entirely at the mercy of the warriors who came down from the hills to secure the beaches. While the great majority of the Armada's vast host had perished at sea or fallen in the frantic fighting among the hills, a remaining force of some 20,000 to 30,000 men were bound and taken alive, turning a massive dynamic invasion into a sudden, immense problem of human storage and administrative disposal. The defenders gathered these thousands from the sands and the shallow reefs of the western provinces, marching them under guard toward various small islands and coastal compounds, including a remote location that the imperial records of the Yuan Shi refer to as Hakakushima. There, beneath the gray autumn sky of 1281, the victorious Kamakura authorities began a systematic process of classification that was remarkably free of emotional vengeance, functioning instead with a severe geopolitical calculation. The prisoners were divided into separate groups based strictly on their land of origin and their perceived loyalty to the great empire that had sent them. For those who belonged to the core administrative and military classes of the Yuan dynasty, the native Mongols, the long subjugated people from the north, whom the chronicles refer to as the Northern Chinese, and the conscripted ranks from the kingdom of Goryeo, the judgment of the warrior court was immediate and absolute. They were marched to the edge of the water and executed. Their lives ended on the same coast they had sought to conquer, as the shogunate sought to ensure that the core military strength of the Khan would never return to the continent. A completely different fate, however, was reserved for the vast numbers of soldiers who comprised the southern fleet, the men who had been recruited from the territories of the old southern Song dynasty. These troops, known to the Japanese defenders as the Jiangnan Army, belonged to a civilization that had only recently been swallowed by the Mongol advance. The Kamakura authorities recognized that these men were not willing instruments of Kublai's ambition, but conquered subjects forced into a foreign harness, and more importantly, they carried within their bodies the sophisticated technical skills of the most advanced urban economy in the world. Yet the decision to save them was born of practical utility rather than cultural mercy. The ancient texts record that the Japanese did not execute them, but instead reduced them to status of laborers and domestic servants, distributing them across the various provinces of western and central Japan. There was a pragmatic calculation in this servitude. A live Mongol soldier was a permanent threat, but a live southern Chinese shipwright, mason, or literate scribe was a valuable asset in a country that was constantly rebuilding its own infrastructure. This organized preservation of life was not a brief casual arrangement, but a state-managed system of captivity that lasted for more than a decade. Years later, a letter from the Korean king thanked the Japanese court for the way these men had been kept and provided for through the long years. A cold administrative gratitude, recording that the great survivors of an imperial armada had quietly become part of the daily ledger of provincial Japanese life, performing their quiet tasks while the memory of the great storm faded into history. The most profound traces of these spared lives, however, are found not in the grand state letters of kings, but in the small private corners of regional religious life, where the presence of the foreign captives left an indelible mark upon the material culture of the provinces. In the spring of 1286, 5 years after the ships had broken in the bay, a great project was underway at a temple known as Shinkoji, located in Izumi Province within modern-day Osaka, where the monks were systematically repairing and correcting the thousands of pages that comprised the Dai Hanya Kyo, the great Buddhist sutra of wisdom. Among the names of official scribes and local patrons who signed their columns of black ink upon a single surviving roll of the text, history left behind the brushwork of a former soldier of the Jiangnan Army, a literate southern Chinese captive who sat quietly in the temple hall, dipping his brush into the dark ink. Among the names was that of a man called Ka-Sano, Hisanyu in his own tongue, a soldier from Ruizhou in the lands of the fallen southern Song. By the time his brush touched the paper in the 4th month of 1286, the Mongol administration on the continent had already renamed his birthplace. But he did not use the new name. He wrote the old one, the name his country had used before it was conquered. Whether because no one had told him it had changed, or because, sitting in a temple at the edge of a country that was not his own, the old name was the one thing left that was still his to keep. The war did not end at an execution ground, nor on a battlefield. In one quiet corner of it, the war ended on a sheet of mulberry paper, where the hand of an enemy soldier moved carefully down a column of characters, mending a sacred text in the language both countries shared. Today, if you visit the quiet archives and regional temples of Osaka and the western provinces, that ancient volume of the Dai Hanya Kyo from Shinkoji is still preserved within its wooden box, away from the light of the modern world. The ink of Kasano has remained dark and clear for 700 years, fixed upon the paper with a permanence that defies the decay of kingdoms. On a still evening in the temple grounds, the shadow of the ancient roof tiles falls softly across the gravel pathways, while the modern traffic of the surrounding city survives only as a low, distant murmur beyond the walls. Inside the hall, the old pages rest in the dark, their columns of characters holding the quiet breath of a man who crossed the sea in terror, survived the great storm, and left the name of his lost home written at the edge of the world. The wind that came after. When the centuries finally closed over the beaches of Kyushu, burying the dark stones of the defense wall beneath shifting sand and coastal pine groves, the memory of those summer weeks began to undergo a strange literary transformation. To the men who had actually stood behind the barriers during the terrifying nights of the invasion, war had been an entirely human, exhausting business, defined by the weight of armor, the flight of arrows, and the desperate competitive need to have one's individual bravery recorded by witnesses. This raw domestic reality was captured with meticulous precision in the years immediately following the conflict by a low-ranking householder from Higo province named Takazaki Suenaga. He was a warrior with small prospects and a large family, and having survived the mud and the explosives of the beach, he spent his private wealth to commission a great narrative scroll known to history as the Moko Shurai Ekotoba, designed for the sole pragmatic purpose of proving his personal exploits to the reward offices of the shogunate. To look upon the faded silk of that long scroll is to see the conflict exactly as the samurai lived it. It is a world filled with the straining of horses, the spray of water, and the anxious faces of individual men clinging to the rigging of ships. Remarkably, across the entire length of Suenaga's painted record, there is no mention of divine intervention, no depiction of supernatural storms, and no indication that the victory belonged to anything other than the stubborn, fluid ferocity of the warriors who fought along the shore. The grand narrative of a miraculous divine wind, the kamikaze, did not blow across the water during the summer of the invasion, but instead rose slowly from the quiet administrative halls and shrine compounds of the capital, long after the last foreign soldier had vanished from the coast. In the years of economic exhaustion that followed the war, when the Kamakura shogunate found itself unable to reward the thousands of warrior families who had spent their fortunes defending the realm, another class of competitors stepped forward to claim the credit for the victory. The powerful religious establishments of the West, including the great shrines of Iwashimizu Hachiman-gu and Hakozaki-gu, began to compile their own alternative accounts of the conflict, seeking to prove that it was their private prayers, their esoteric rituals, and the spiritual power of their deities that had summoned the typhoon to clear the sea. This theological ambition found its permanent shape in a text called the Hachiman Gudokun, written by shrine monks who deliberately portrayed the defending samurai as near helpless in order to make the intervention of the gods appear all the more absolute. In the strange economy of medieval politics, this literary strategy proved remarkably efficient, shifting a heavy atmospheric low-pressure system into a continuous policy of divine protection, wearing away the sharp human edges of the crisis until people forgot that the wall had ever been built by human hands. While the ink on the temple scrolls was transforming the typhoon into a religious legend, the physical truth of that terrifying night remained locked in absolute silence beneath the western waves, preserved by the deep mud of the ocean floor. 700 years after the Armada broke, the young science of underwater archaeology began to bring that buried world back into the afternoon light, shifting the history of the war from the ambiguous territory of legends into the immense, three-dimensional mass of material culture. At the Takashima Kozaki site in Matsura, modern-day Nagasaki, researchers working in the quiet gray depths of Imari Bay discovered that the seabed held a massive, undisturbed repository of the 13th century, sealed beneath a meter of fine silt. Using advanced sonar equipment and precise underwater excavations, archaeologists managed to locate the remains of actual Yuan dynasty vessels, bringing up timber keels, massive stone anchors, and the intact personal belongings of the men who had sat upon those decks during the summer heat. These discoveries revealed that the invasion was not a primitive raid, but a collision with the most sophisticated material civilization of its era, revealing an empire that could command the industrial output of an entire continent. The material culture recovered from the silt performed a profound function, providing a vivid, three-dimensional reality to the flat-painted worlds of the old scrolls. When researchers placed the recovered fragments of tetsuhao, those ancient ceramic explosives, into the large industrial X-ray scanners of the Kyushu National Museum, they discovered that these spheres were not mere instruments of noise and light designed to terrify horses, but highly lethal weapons packed with gunpowder, scrap iron, and pottery shards designed to scatter with devastating force. Similarly, chemical analysis of the thousands of small lacquer plates that formed the armor of the Southern Fleet revealed that the base material was made of animal hides, coated thickly with a sophisticated red lacquer that contained high concentrations of mercury and iron. It was an advanced product of the complex lacquer workshops of southern China, revealing how the exquisite domestic arts of a conquered civilization had been systematically turned toward the machinery of total war. Among the records on the mainland, history also preserved the quiet signature of the captive soldier Ka Sano at Shinkoji Temple, who left the old name of his hometown fixed upon the mulberry paper of a sacred sutra long after his continent had changed its maps. His isolated brushstroke remains, a single human mark that outlasted the grand administrative calculations of empires. There is an enduring distance between the words used to reshape the past and the physical weight of the objects left behind in the dark. The grand documents of states and the pious scrolls of shrines operate like the coastal wind, gradually eroding the difficult human realities of a crisis until only a comfortable, uniform memory remains. Yet beneath the silent waters of Imari Bay, the physical remnants refuse this slow erasure. The heavy timber hulls, the shattered iron casings, and the thousands of red lacquer plates embedded in the silt cannot be altered by a text. They do not tell a story of national exceptionalism or divine favor. They hold the concrete density of a single catastrophic night, proving the existence of the nameless men who actually felt the weight of the sea. The myths may govern the imagination of the generations that followed, but the iron in the mud and the dark ink on the paper still keep the true measure of those who stood at the edge of the world. The long vigils along the bay are finished, The administrative debts are settled, and the landscape rests under the quiet shadow of the night. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting for you on the screen right now. For those who are ready to leave the gray horizons of the strait, let your body grow heavy, adjust your pillow, and let your shoulders ease down away from your ears. The lanterns are dimmed, the old walls are still, and the night is perfectly quiet. Sleep well.